You are not allowed to be in this seat. Move right now.
Your bag doesn't belong here. Move it. That's my bag, and I'm not moving it.
Get up! I am not getting up! GET up now! I said I am not moving!
You think you're better than me? You're beneath me.
Sir, please sit down. We don't want any trouble.
Do it now! He's at gate 12!
Wait, this is a mistake. I can explain.
It's handled. Good.
You may want to review pages 7 and 8, sir. No, that's impossible. This isn't real.
Boots. Sir, we need you to stand up right now. Elijah Cross did not stand up. He looked at the boarding pass glowing on his phone, seat 2A, confirmed, paid in full, and he looked at the two uniformed men waiting in the aisle like they were waiting for a door to open. Boots. His hands stayed flat on his knees. His breathing stayed even. Somewhere behind him, a woman in pearls was already smiling, like the outcome had been decided before anyone asked a single honest question. Boots. Freeze every dollar tied to that airline. Every dollar. Nobody signs anything until I say so. That order would go out 4 minutes after Elijah walked off that airplane, and it would not come from a lawyer or a press office. Boots. It would come from him, in a voice so quiet the man on the other end of the phone would ask him twice to repeat it, certain he had misheard. Boots. But that moment was still an hour away. 6 hours before it, Elijah Cross was standing in the concourse of Charlotte Douglas International Airport at 5:20 in the morning, holding a paper cup of black coffee that had gone lukewarm somewhere between the security line and gate C14. Boots. He wore a gray crewneck sweatshirt with a small hole near the cuff, dark jeans, and a pair of running shoes that had clearly logged more miles walking through airports than running anywhere at all. Boots. Over his shoulder hung a brown leather satchel, cracked at the corners, with a small brass compass stitched into the flap, worn smooth by thousands of hours of thumbs passing over it without thinking. Boots. It had belonged to his father, a merchant marine navigator, who used to say that a compass does not care how loud the storm is. Boots. It only cares which way is true. Cross Meridian Capital, the firm Elijah had built from nothing over 18 years, was 72 hours away from finalizing a $3.6 billion investment into Baycrest Airlines, a mid-size regional carrier trying to become something bigger. Boots. His firm could have chartered a private jet for this trip. His assistant had offered, twice. His head of communications had strongly suggested it, citing optics and risk. Boots. Elijah had declined both times, quietly, the way he declined most things that separated him from what he was actually trying to understand. Boots. He wanted to fly Baycrest exactly the way an ordinary passenger would fly it. No escort. No lanyard announcing who he worked for. Boots. No advance notice to the gate. If his firm was going to put $3.6 billion behind this airline's name, he wanted to know what that name actually felt like from inside a coach line at 5 in the morning. And then, later that day, from inside the first-class cabin he had paid for with his own card. Boots. Near the priority boarding sign, an older man in a faded Army veteran's cap struggled with a rolling suitcase whose front wheel had locked sideways. Boots. Elijah set his coffee on a nearby ledge, crouched and freed the wheel with 2 efficient motions before the man had even finished apologizing for the inconvenience. Boots. The man thanked him 3 times. Elijah told him the wheel was the airport's fault, not his, and picked his coffee back up. Boots. A few feet away, a woman in a cream trench coat pulled her designer tote a half-inch closer to her body as Elijah passed. Boots. She did not look at him directly. She did not have to. Elijah felt the small, familiar tightening behind his sternum, the one that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with recognition. Boots. His mother's voice arrived the way it always did in moments like this, unhurried and certain. In rooms like these, some people will decide who you are before you open your mouth. Boots. Let them be wrong. Do not spend your breath convincing them otherwise. His boarding pass read Baycrest Flight 617, Seat 2A, First Class, confirmed. Boots. He had selected that seat himself, 22 days earlier. On the same afternoon, he had signed the preliminary term sheet for the investment. Boots. By the time he walked down the jet bridge and settled into that seat, it existed in every system Baycrest operated as his, cleanly and without exception. Boots. What happened to that seat over the next 40 minutes would not be a mistake. It would be a decision made by several different people, each one telling themselves it was a small thing. Boots. He placed the satchel in the overhead bin, sat down, and opened a tablet holding an internal audit his due diligence team had compiled 2 weeks earlier. Boots. It documented Baycrest's passenger complaint system in uncomfortable detail. Response delays measured in weeks instead of days, inconsistent case labeling, a startling number of filed complaints that had never once reached a human reviewer before being automatically closed. Boots. One sentence, highlighted the night before, sat at the center of the document like a splinter. A complaint stops meaning anything the moment a system decides what happened before a person is allowed to read it. Boots. He was still thinking about that sentence when he heard a voice behind him, pleasant and certain of its own reasonableness. Boots. I think there's been a small mix-up here. The man who said it was Gerald Ashcombe, 59 years old, silver-haired, wearing a navy travel blazer that had clearly never been slept in. Boots. He checked a gold watch on his wrist before he addressed anyone directly, as though time itself owed him an apology for the delay. Boots. Behind him stood his wife, Vivian, holding a cream tote against her hip, her eyes moving between Elijah and the overhead bin, like she was doing quiet arithmetic and not liking the answer. Boots. Gerald did not speak to Elijah. He raised 2 fingers toward the galley the way a man flags a waiter at a restaurant where he is a regular. Boots. A flight attendant named Denise Colby appeared within seconds, her professional smile already fully assembled before she understood what she was walking into. Boots. Mr. Ashcombe, good morning. Is everything all right? Gerald explained in the tone of a man who has explained this exact situation many times before and expects the world to keep agreeing with him that the system had separated him from his wife. Boots. He had seat 2B, Vivian had 5C. They were Baycrest Diamond members, they flew this route constantly, and they always sat together in this row. Boots. Denise checked her tablet. Seat 2A showed Elijah Cross, confirmed, full first-class fare, no service flag, no upgrade notation, nothing irregular in any field. Boots. There was no error to correct. There was nothing to interpret. She glanced at Elijah. She glanced at Vivian's tote bag, at Gerald's watch, at the diamond status glowing on her screen. Boots. Then she said the words that would open the door to everything that followed. Let me see what I can do for you. Boots. She turned to Elijah and leaned in slightly, lowering her voice as though volume alone could make the request sound smaller than it was. Boots. Sir, we have another first-class seat available in 7D. Would you be willing to help us keep the Ashcombes together? Boots. Elijah looked down the aisle. Seat 7D sat beside the lavatory. It had no window. 2 passengers were still wrestling with the overhead bin above it, trying to force a suitcase that clearly did not fit. Boots. Why can't the passenger in 5C simply move to 2B, he asked. Denise's smile held its shape, but the warmth behind it cooled by several degrees. Boots. They're traveling together, sir. This would only be a small adjustment. Small. The word landed on him with a weight it had carried before, in hotel lobbies, in boardrooms, on aircraft very much like this one. Boots. Small adjustment. Small courtesy. Small concession. The word was always attached to something that was already his, offered back to him as though giving it up would cost him nothing at all. Boots. I'd like to keep the seat I paid for, he said. His voice stayed level. His hand stayed flat on the tablet in his lap. Boots. Gerald checked his watch again, exhaling through his nose with the patience of a man who fully expects to be understood eventually, if only someone would explain the situation to the right person more carefully. Boots. He said this loudly enough that it was clearly meant for the row, not for Elijah alone. Vivian leaned toward Denise and lowered her voice, though not nearly far enough to keep Elijah from hearing every word. Boots. Was he perhaps upgraded at the gate? I purchased this seat, Elijah said before Denise could answer for him. Vivian smiled quickly. Boots. I was only asking, but the question had already done its work. It had placed Elijah's right to sit in 2A under review, while Gerald's preference sat comfortably above question, untouched, assumed. Boots. Denise looked at Elijah's sweatshirt, at the small hole near the cuff, then back at Gerald's status tier glowing green on her screen. Boots. She had the correct answer directly in front of her. She chose to treat it as a problem anyway. May I see your boarding pass? She asked him. Boots. You already checked it, Elijah said quietly. I need to verify it directly, sir. He unlocked his phone and handed it over. Boots. She examined it the way a person examines something they are hoping will eventually say something different. Passenger name. Confirmation number. Boots. Fare class. She scrolled down. She scrolled back up, as though the truth might change if she looked at it from a slightly different angle. Boots. Do you have identification with you? Elijah reached for his wallet slower than usual, because he recognized this exact pattern, the way a person recognizes a road they have driven blind in the dark before. Boots. First the ticket, then the identification, then, somewhere folded inside both, the real question nobody would say out loud. How did a man like you get here? Boots. He handed over his North Carolina driver's license. Denise set it beside the phone and compared the photograph for far longer than the comparison required. Boots. Elijah said nothing. He gave her the silence, one final chance to hear what she was doing and stop on her own. Boots. She did not stop. Behind her, a younger flight attendant named Renata Choi had been standing near the galley with a meal checklist forgotten in her hand. Boots. She had watched the entire exchange begin with the ordinary shape of a seating dispute, the kind that resolves itself in 2 minutes once the facts are checked. Boots. But the facts had been clear from the very first sentence, and this had already taken 9. She opened Elijah's reservation on her own screen. Boots. Full first-class fare. Booked 22 days earlier. Seat selected at purchase. Identity verified at the gate that morning. No upgrade request anywhere in the record. Boots. No payment flag. Nothing that should have invited a second look from anyone. She stepped closer and spoke quietly to Denise. Boots. His ticket is completely clean. I can see that, Denise said, jaw tightening. I'm making sure. Making sure of what? Elijah asked. Boots. Denise returned his phone and license without answering. This is routine verification, sir, she said instead, and something in her tone had already shifted. Boots. The professional warmth was gone, replaced by something colder and far more deliberate. She was no longer handling a passenger. Boots. She understood now that she was handling someone who intended to keep a record of exactly what she said. There's no need to make this formal, she added. Boots. I'm asking you to document what actually happened, Elijah said. He set his water cup down carefully on the armrest tray, each motion controlled, unhurried, precise, because the effort of keeping his voice level enough that nobody could later describe it as hostile was taking everything he had. Boots. Gerald placed a hand briefly on Denise's elbow and steered her 2 steps toward the galley, keeping his voice low, though Elijah caught the shape of it anyway. Boots. They had flown Baycrest for 11 years. If the airline could not manage a simple seating matter for Diamond members, they would be reaching out to corporate leadership directly today. By name. Boots. Denise nodded and stepped away to make a call. The man on the other end of that call was Marlon Petrie, 54, a ground operations supervisor who had worked at Charlotte Douglas for 16 years and was currently thinking about exactly one thing: closing that aircraft door before the departure window expired. Boots. Denise explained the situation in the compressed shorthand airline staff use with each other, the kind that skips full sentences entirely. Boots. Diamond member. Seating adjustment needed. Passenger in 2A not cooperating. Marlon pulled up the reservation. He saw Elijah's confirmed assignment. Boots. He saw Gerald's status tier. He understood that if he refused the request, Denise would simply call again in 5 minutes. And if he approved it, this would be closed out in under 2 minutes, and he could move on to the next problem, stacking up in his queue. Boots. He opened the seat modification panel and selected a code labeled Member Recovery Review, a code that existed for genuine booking errors and documented service failures involving high-status travelers. Boots. It did not exist to override a valid, confirmed occupied seat simply because another passenger preferred it. A warning appeared on his screen. Boots. Seat occupied by confirmed passenger. Manual override requires documented operational justification. Marlon dismissed it. A second warning appeared. He dismissed that one too. Boots. Seat 2A changed from confirmed to seat under review. On Renata's tablet, the small green indicator beside Elijah's name shifted to amber. Boots. She checked the timestamp. The change had been entered 9 minutes after Elijah boarded. Without incident, without complaint, without a single flag anywhere in the record before that moment. Boots. Her stomach dropped. She lifted her phone, photographed the screen before the timestamp could scroll out of view, then attached the image to an unsent draft email and slid the phone face down into her uniform pocket. Boots. She did not yet know who the safe person to send it to was. She only knew she was not going to let this moment disappear as though it had never happened. Boots. Denise returned to the row. The system is currently reviewing your seat assignment, she told Elijah. He raised his own phone. Boots. The Baycrest app still showed 2A as confirmed on his end, unchanged. Who changed it, he asked. Denise glanced at her tablet, then toward the galley, and did not answer. Boots. Across the aisle, a woman named Harold Whitfield, 71 years old, a retired federal litigator who had spent 4 decades reading rooms exactly like this one for a living, had lowered her magazine several minutes earlier and positioned her phone low against the seat back in front of her, angled precisely through the gap between the headrests. Boots. She had spent enough years in courtrooms to recognize the sound of a record being shaped before the facts were settled. Boots. She kept the camera steady and said absolutely nothing. The cabin had gone still in a very particular way. Not quiet the way a room is quiet when nothing is happening, but still the way a room goes still when everyone has silently decided to watch without appearing to watch at all. Boots. No page turned. No cup clinked. Somewhere behind the curtain, the coffee machine finished its cycle and shut off, and the small mechanical click of it seemed to echo through the whole cabin. Boots. Denise positioned herself over Elijah again. Sir, seat 7D is still available. We can move your bag and have you settled in under a minute. Boots. Can you give me the reason for the seat change in writing? He asked. There's no need for paperwork. We're offering an equivalent first-class seat. Boots. It is not equivalent, and my seat was confirmed until someone changed the record without telling me why. Gerald exhaled into the aisle and checked his watch a 3rd time. Boots. Elijah turned toward him for the first time since the dispute began. I want to know why my seat changed after you asked for it. Boots. Why? Gerald's face tightened. I didn't ask for anything that belonged to you. I asked the airline to take care of its longtime customers. Boots. He put a small, deliberate weight on the last 2 words, as though 11 years of loyalty points conferred a claim stronger than a boarding pass paid for in full that same morning. Boots. Vivian adjusted the strap of her tote. There are certain ways people are expected to conduct themselves in a cabin like this one. Boots. Harold's voice came from across the aisle, quiet but perfectly clear. What behavior, exactly, are you referring to? Vivian looked across, startled, her expression hardening the moment she registered who had spoken and noticed the phone still in Harold's hand. Boots. I wasn't speaking to you, I know, Harold said. I'm asking what he's done. Denise stepped between them. Sir, I need you to lower your voice. Boots. Gerald had, at that point, been the loudest voice in the cabin by a wide margin. Elijah had not moved from his seat at all. Boots. He studied Denise for several seconds, giving her time to hear her own words land in the silence. Is my voice louder than Mr. Boots? Ashcombs, he asked. She did not answer. She unlocked the notes field on her tablet and began typing with her thumb. Boots. Harold zoomed in from across the aisle and caught part of the sentence before it scrolled away. Passenger becoming resistant to reasonable accommodation. Boots. The clean official language was doing something precise and damaging. It was taking Vivian's suspicion, Gerald's pressure, the double identity check, and the manual override, and folding all of it into a single phrase that made Elijah's simple request for an explanation look like the actual problem. Boots. Renata saw the note from the edge of the galley, she said quietly. He hasn't refused a single instruction. Denise turned her head sharply. Boots. Come with me. She pulled Renata behind the galley curtain and let it fall closed behind them. When she spoke, her voice dropped low and flat. Boots. You're still on a 90-day review. Do not insert yourself into something outside your assignment. Renata's stomach pulled tight. One complaint on file, filed by a supervisor 2 months earlier, over a scheduling dispute that had nothing to do with any of this, and now it was being used as a leash. Boots. She said nothing more. She stepped back to the galley edge and kept the phone in her pocket instead of her hand, but she did not stop watching. Boots. The captain arrived 7 minutes later. His name was Alan Foss, and he walked down the aisle checking his watch against the clock mounted above the cabin door, already thinking about the departure window closing behind him. Boots. He did not ask Renata what she had observed. He did not check the timestamp on the seat status change. Boots. He did not ask Marlon why a confirmed occupied seat had been flagged for review without cause. By the time he reached row 2, the problem had already been named for him by the people standing closest to him. Boots. Gerald stood the moment he saw the captain's stripes. "Captain, I appreciate you stepping in." Foss looked at him and Vivian with a brief, practiced expression. Boots. "Are you and your wife all right?" Gerald said they were fine, but that the situation had gone on long enough. Boots. Foss nodded and turned to Elijah. "I need you to check the time the seat status was changed," Elijah said. Boots. Foss glanced at Denise instead of answering. "My crew has made a decision here, and I need your cooperation." Harold spoke from across the aisle without lifting her voice. Boots. The cooperation problem started after he asked to see the record. Foss raised one hand. "Ma'am, please let the crew handle this." Boots. "They're handling it on camera," Harold replied, and her voice carried without any effort at all. The way a courtroom voice carries when it has not needed volume to make a point in 30 years. Boots. Foss faced Elijah again. "Will you accept seat 7D? I had a valid ticket for 2A, Elijah said. "I showed my boarding pass." Boots. "I showed my identification. The seat changed after Mr. Ashcombe asked for it. No one has identified a safety concern of any kind." Boots. He said each sentence separately and evenly, without inflection, not as an argument but as a record being read into the air for anyone listening to hear. Boots. Foss's eyes moved to his watch. Ground operations had already radioed once about the closing window. He could see two paths in front of him. Boots. One involved pulling the seat change record and asking who had authorized a manual override on an occupied confirmed seat with no operational justification. Boots. The other involved removing the man asking the questions. The first path took time he did not have. The second took 90 seconds. Boots. "Step into the jet bridge with me," Foss said. "We can speak privately out there." Elijah went very still. "If I step through that door, will I be allowed back onto this aircraft?" Boots. Foss paused, and the pause lasted a beat too long. "That depends on how the conversation goes." Elijah understood exactly what was being offered. Boots. If he stood and walked out on his own, Denise could log it as a voluntary departure. If he objected once he was already standing in that jet bridge, any description of his tone could be written up as confirmation of whatever the crew had already decided about him. Boots. The door was not an invitation to speak freely. It was a way to make his removal look like something he had chosen. Boots. He stayed seated. His jaw was tight now, and the effort of controlling it showed plainly in his face for the first time that morning. Boots. "You've already decided you want me to stand up on my own," he said, "so the incident report reads cleaner." Boots. Color rose along Foss's neck. Gerald leaned forward. "That is exactly the attitude we have been dealing with." Denise opened the incident notes and typed a new line. Boots. Renata saw the words appear from where she stood, passenger challenging captain's authority. Renata also saw Elijah's hands, resting flat against his knees. Boots. They had not moved once since this began. "I follow every rule there is," Elijah said, turning to Gerald one final time. Boots. "You still need me to prove I belong here." Gerald looked away. Vivian adjusted her tote strap again, the small motion she seemed to reach for whenever she needed something to do with her hands. Boots. Foss reached for the interphone and pressed the ground security button. His voice was quiet, but in the silence of that cabin it carried to every row. Boots. Ground security to the aircraft, first-class cabin, passenger removal. Renata looked down at the screenshot still saved in her draft email. Boots. The crew had created a situation, written it into an official record, and then called security to respond to the very record they had just written themselves. Boots. She was standing in the middle of it, and no one had asked her a single question about what she had actually seen. Boots. 2 security officers boarded 4 minutes later. The one in front, badge reading D. Voss, had received a radio call that was brief and already decided. Boots. Passenger refusing crew instruction, first-class seat dispute. No mention of a boarding pass, no mention of a reservation change entered 9 minutes after boarding, without incident. Boots. No mention of 2 dismissed system warnings. Voss walked down the aisle with the posture of a man who believed the important work had already been finished before he ever arrived. Boots. Foss met him at the galley divider and pointed toward row 2. "Sir, we need you to come with us," Voss said, stopping beside the seat. Boots. "Am I being accused of a crime?" Elijah asked. "No. Have I threatened anyone?" Voss glanced briefly at Foss, waiting for the captain to answer for him. Boots. Harold held her phone perfectly steady and did not lower it. Denise stood with her tablet pressed to her chest, eyes fixed forward. Boots. Renata stood at the edge of the galley. her expression the particular blankness of a person holding herself very carefully in place so nothing shows. Boots. Elijah looked at Voss for a long moment. Then he nodded once, reached up, and pulled his father's satchel down from the overhead bin. Boots. His right hand trembled slightly as his fingers closed around the strap, and he did not try to hide it. Boots. He turned in the narrow aisle, and his shoulder caught the edge of a headrest. The sound it made was small. Boots. In the silence of that cabin, it carried the length of the entire plane. Voss reached for the bag. Elijah shifted it away and took the full weight himself. Boots. He stood still for a moment, counting to 4, without letting the count show on his face, then stepped into the aisle and walked toward the front of the aircraft. Boots. At the cabin door he stopped. He did not see Harold's camera. He did not know about the screenshot sitting in Renata's draft email. Boots. He only saw Renata's face, the visible conflict in it, the particular tension of a person who knows the true version of something and has not yet decided what she is going to do with what she knows. Boots. He did not know her name. He spoke to the expression instead. "Whatever you saw in here," he said quietly. "Remember it accurately." Boots. Renata lowered her eyes. The aircraft door closed behind him. The jet bridge was cold, and the overhead fluorescents were the flat, colorless kind that make everything look slightly less real than it is. Boots. Voss walked beside him. The second officer trailed several steps behind. Their shoes made clean, sharp sounds against the metal walkway. Boots. "You could have avoided all of this by accepting the other seat," Voss said, without any real hostility in his voice. "The way people say things they genuinely believe are obvious." Boots. Elijah stopped walking. "Did you read my boarding pass before you came onto that plane?" Voss's face tightened. He had not. Boots. "That's not the issue at this point," Voss said. "It was the issue before you ever arrived," Elijah said. "The crew gave you an instruction, and you carried it out without asking a single question about what it was actually based on." Boots. Voss said nothing. He had no answer for that, which meant, in some narrow but important way, that he already knew. Boots. At the top of the jet bridge, standing near the gate desk with a phone pressed to her ear, was a woman in a charcoal blazer, 46 years old, badge reading N. Boots. Ostrander, Director of Communications. She had been on the phone with a colleague about an unrelated matter when the security call came through the airport's internal channel, and something in the phrase first-class cab and passenger removal made her stop walking toward her gate and start walking toward this one instead. Boots. She had learned, over 11 years in this industry, that the phrase equivalent seat almost never meant equivalent, and that removals which happen this fast almost never happened for the reason written in the first report. Boots. She reached Elijah just as Voss was preparing to walk him toward the terminal exit. "Sir," she said, "may I ask you a few questions before you leave the gate area?" Boots. Elijah looked at her badge, then at her face. "I'd rather speak with someone who can actually answer them." "That's me for the moment," Naomi Ostrander said. Boots. "Can you tell me exactly what happened from the beginning without skipping anything?" he told her. All of it in the same level, unhurried voice he had used on the plane, each fact laid down like a stone in a wall. Boots. The confirmed seat booked 22 days earlier. The Ashcombs' request. The seat status change entered 9 minutes after boarding. The 2 dismissed warnings. Boots. The offer of seat 7D as an equivalent. The captain's 90-second decision. Naomi wrote none of it down, because she was recording it on her phone with his permission, and because she had learned that people who are telling the truth do not usually need paper to keep their stories straight. Boots. While she listened, her own phone buzzed. A text from a contact in the corporate legal department, forwarded from someone in finance who had just received an unusual notification from Cross Meridian Capital's outside counsel. Boots. Naomi read it twice. Then she looked up at Elijah with an entirely different expression on her face. "Mr. Cross," she said quietly. Boots. "You're the Cross in Cross Meridian." He didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. The silence did the confirming for him. Boots. Naomi closed her eyes for exactly 1 second, the way a person does when they feel a very large and very avoidable mistake settling into place behind their ribs. Boots. Then she opened them and said, "I need you to wait right here. I need to make 1 phone call, and then I need you to talk to someone whose job is actually big enough to fix this." Boots. She was already dialing before she finished the sentence. Elijah had not raised his voice once. He had not said his own name, had not mentioned the investment, had not reached for a single advantage available to him beyond the plain fact that he was right. Boots. Somewhere down the jet bridge, in the terminal beyond it, and in a boardroom 400 miles away, that fact was about to travel faster than anyone on that flight had planned for. Boots. He stood by the gate window, satchel over his shoulder, thumb resting against the small brass compass stitched into the flap, and watched Flight 617 push back from the gate without him. Boots. 40 minutes later, Elijah was seated in a private airline lounge with a cup of black coffee he had no intention of drinking, across the table from Naomi Ostrander and a man who introduced himself as Preston Hale, the chief executive officer of Baycrest Airlines, who had driven from a downtown meeting in under 20 minutes because Naomi's phone call had used exactly 4 words that guaranteed his full attention. Boots. We may have a problem. Preston Hale was 51, silver at the temples, the kind of executive who had spent 2 decades learning to sound calm in rooms that were on fire. Boots. He did not sound calm now. Mr. Cross, he said, I want to be completely direct with you. I have read the incident notes filed on this flight, and I have read the timestamp on the seat status change, and those 2 documents do not agree with each other. Boots. I intend to find out exactly why. I already froze the funding, Elijah said quietly. Preston's jaw tensed, but he nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he already knows the decision is fair, even as it costs him something enormous. Boots. Then you have every right to have done that. He turned to Naomi. Pull the full flight recording. Pull Marlon Petrie's override log. Boots. Pull the cockpit voice recorder audio from the ground portion of that flight. I want every second of it on my desk by 6 o'clock tonight, and I want to know who dismissed those 2 system warnings and why. Boots. Naomi was already typing notes into her phone. There's a passenger across the aisle who was filming, she said. Retired attorney, seat 5C on the original manifest. Name of Harold Whitfield. Boots. If she's willing to share that footage, it will settle any question about tone or sequence immediately. There's also a flight attendant, Elijah said. Boots. Renata Choi. She tried to speak up in there and got told to stay out of it because she's on some kind of review. Boots. Whatever that review is about, I'd start there, because she was the only person on that aircraft who checked the facts before she opened her mouth. Boots. Preston wrote the name down himself, by hand, on a small notepad, the old-fashioned kind of gesture that meant he intended to remember it without a system to remind him. Boots. The investigation that followed did not stay quiet, and it did not stay small. Harold Whitfield's footage, offered freely once she understood exactly what it would be used for, showed 11 uninterrupted minutes of exactly what had happened in that cabin, time-stamped, unedited, and impossible to argue with. Boots. Renata Choi's screenshot, recovered from her draft folder at Naomi's request, showed the precise moment the seat status changed, 9 minutes and 11 seconds after boarding, with no complaint, no safety concern, and no service flag anywhere in the record before that instant. Boots. Marlon Petrie was suspended within 48 hours, pending review, for dismissing 2 mandatory system warnings without documented justification. Boots. When investigators asked him directly why he had overridden a confirmed occupied seat, he said the same 6 words 3 separate times, in 3 separate interviews, as though repeating them enough might eventually make them sound like a real answer, instead of an excuse. Boots. I was just trying to help. Denise Colby was placed on administrative leave the same week. Boots. In her first interview with Baycrest's internal review team, she insisted she had only been trying to accommodate a loyal customer, that she had followed the same pattern she had used for years without complaint, that nobody had ever told her it was wrong before. Boots. She did not, in that first interview, use the word sorry a single time. Boots. Captain Alan Foss was suspended for 60 days without pay, the maximum allowed under his union contract short of termination, for initiating a passenger removal without verifying the underlying record, and for offering a passenger a private conversation in a jet bridge under conditions that functioned, in the review board's own written language, as coercive rather than voluntary. Boots. It was Gerald and Vivian Ashcombe whose consequences arrived slowest and landed hardest because, unlike the employees, they had no supervisor to answer to and no job to lose. Boots. What they had was a membership, a reputation among the small, tightly networked circle of Charlotte's business community, and, as it turned out, a business of their own. Boots. Gerald ran a regional insurance brokerage that depended heavily on referrals from exactly the kind of corporate clients who had, within the same week the story broke in the local business press, begun quietly asking around about what had actually happened on Flight 617. Boots. Baycrest's legal team reviewed the terms of the Ashcom's Diamond membership and found a provision, rarely enforced but clearly written, prohibiting members from misrepresenting a situation to staff in order to obtain preferential treatment over another confirmed passenger. Boots. Harold Whitfield's footage showed Gerald telling Denise the system had separated them, a claim the flight manifest proved false from the very beginning, since 5C had never been Vivian's assigned seat at all until Gerald requested it be changed after boarding. Boots. Their membership was terminated permanently, with a formal letter explaining exactly why. Boots. 2 months later, at a Charlotte Chamber of Commerce dinner, neither of them had realized Elijah would be attending. As a keynote sponsor, Vivian Ashcombe found herself standing near the dessert table, with nowhere else to look, when Elijah walked past with a plate in his hand. Boots. She had spent 2 months rehearsing several different versions of what she might say if this ever happened, most of them defensive, some of them worse. Boots. What came out instead surprised her. "I didn't think of it as taking something from you," she said quietly. "I thought of it as us simply mattering more in that moment." Boots. I've had 2 months to sit with how ugly that sounds out loud. Elijah looked at her for a long moment. Boots. That's the first true thing either of you has said about that morning, he said. Then he walked on, because he had nothing left to prove to her, and no interest in performing forgiveness for a room that was watching. Boots. Gerald never managed the same sentence. Boots. At a mediation session, required by the Airline's legal settlement with Elijah's firm, he sat across a conference table and said, more than once, that he still believed he had simply been advocating for his family, that the crew had made their own decisions, that he could not be held responsible for what a captain and a flight attendant chose to do with a request. Boots. It was only when the mediator played 11 unedited minutes of Harold Whitfield's footage, his own voice explaining a system error that had never existed, that something in his face finally changed. Boots. He sat very still for almost a full minute afterward. Then he said, quietly, mostly to himself, I don't think I've ever had to watch myself do that before. Boots. Elijah did not respond. He did not need to. The recording had already said everything that needed saying in Gerald's own voice, played back to him in a room with nowhere left to hide. Boots. Renata Choi's 90-day review, it turned out, had been opened over a minor scheduling dispute completely unrelated to her conduct, character, or judgment, a detail Baycrest's Human Resources Department had simply never bothered to communicate clearly to her supervising crew lead. Boots. The review was closed with no findings against her. Boots. 6 weeks later, Preston Hale personally invited her to join a newly created Passenger Advocacy Council, reporting directly to his office, a role with no operational authority, but full access to every complaint filed against the airline, and a standing seat at the table when policy changes were discussed. Boots. She was not the one who had filmed the footage that proved the case. She was the one who had checked the facts before anyone else in that cabin had bothered to, and Preston made a point of saying so publicly, by name, at the company's next all-staff meeting. Boots. The full internal audit Elijah had been reading before any of this began, the one documenting years of buried and mislabeled complaints, was published in its entirety 3 months later, alongside a public accounting of exactly how many prior incidents shared the same shape as Flight 617. Boots. 14. 14 previous cases across 6 years where a confirmed seat had been reassigned under a member recovery code with no documented justification, and where the passenger who lost that seat shared a pattern investigators were careful not to phrase as a coincidence. Boots. Preston Hale did not resign, but he stood in front of every camera that asked him to and said, without qualification, that the pattern was real, that it had existed before his tenure and continued under it, and that publishing it was the only honest response available to him. Boots. Cross Meridian Capital's investment, once the frozen funds were released, came with a new condition neither side had originally planned for: an independent passenger rights office, funded for 5 years, with a direct reporting line to the board, and full authority to reclassify any complaint the airline's own systems had closed without human review. Boots. 11 months after Flight 617, pushed back without him. Elijah Cross returned to Charlotte Douglas on a cold Tuesday morning, wearing the same gray sweatshirt with the small hole near the cuff, carrying his father's satchel, with the brass compass still stitched into the flap. Boots. He had no escort. No one from his firm was waiting at the curb. At the gate, a small printed notice had been added to the boarding display, stating in plain, specific language that loyalty status could not be used to modify the confirmed seat assignment of another passenger under any circumstance. Boots. The gate agent scanned his boarding pass, looked up, and smiled. "Good morning, Mr. Cross. Seat 2A. He thanked her and walked down the jet bridge. Boots. Near the aircraft door, an elderly woman was struggling to lift a heavy rolling bag into the overhead compartment, working it with the stubborn determination of someone who had decided not to ask for help and was starting to reconsider. Boots. Elijah stopped. "Would you like a hand with that?" She looked at him, surprised by the offer, and nodded. He lifted the bag into the bin and closed the door cleanly. Boots. "Thank you," she said. "My arms aren't what they used to be." "Neither is the compartment latch," he said. She laughed, and he walked to row 2 and sat down in seat 2A. Boots. Morning light spread across the wing outside his window. No one on that aircraft knew who he was. No one looked up when he passed. Boots. He opened his satchel, thumb brushing once over the small brass compass on the flap, and found a new briefing waiting inside for a different company, a different quarter, the same kind of work. Boots. He began reading. Somewhere behind him, a flight attendant moved down the aisle checking seatbacks. Unhurried, unremarkable, exactly the way it was supposed to look when a system was finally, quietly, working the way it was built to. Boots. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who has ever been asked to prove they belonged somewhere they already had every right to be. Boots. Leave a comment and tell me honestly, have you ever stood in that cabin on either side of it? I read every single one.